Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we'll be discussing another important Western philosopher who shaped the political philosophy, and he basically transformed the idea of politics in the way that we perceive it today. And the philosopher that we'll be discussing today is none other than Machiavelli. I've mentioned two phrases here. The first is the ruthless realist of politics and the dark genius of power politics. So these two statements clearly indicate the kind of political philosophy Machiavelli had. Machiavelli focused on, idea of a very different form of politics or political approach, which was very different from that of the classical philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And in the modern day, in terms of modern day political tools, we talk about attributes like power, fear, and manipulation. These specific ideas were discussed by Machiavelli about 500 years ago. Niccolo Machiavelli is his full name, and he's considered as the father of political realism, who tore apart the idealism of his time and showed us what politics really is. And not only is this, but we must have a brief understanding of Machiavelli's background, his political upbringing, his influences. And Machiavelli, professionally, he was a diplomat and a political thinker in Renaissance Italy. It was a time of chaos, shifting alliances, and constant war. He wrote his book, The Prince, in the year 1513, and it is considered the best of his work. And it basically wasn't a guide to morality. As we study the works of Aristotle and Plato, we see that they're constantly preaching about morality, ethics, virtue. But Machiavelli in his book did not make morality and ethics as his central idea. His book was, a manual for survival and control. And we see that when he was born in the period of Renaissance, there was a lot of political chaos and instability. He was born in Italy, and at that time, Italy wasn't a united country as we see it today. It was divided into various city-states like Venice, Florence, Milan, and various papal states. And there was a constant state of warfare happening. These states, the ethnicity, the Italian ethnicity at that time was in war with each other. They were not united as a state, and this created a lot of challenges. And while Machiavelli worked as a diplomat in the Florentine Republic, he dealt with various kings, popes, and mercenary commanders. He had a first-hand experience of how power actually worked. So whenever we talk about Machiavelli's political philosophy, it is said that it is not a political philosophy. It is basically a political handbook of how the rulers should be. It is not about how politics should be. It majorly talks about what is actually done and how things are achieved. It does not focus on the ideal side of politics. It's a very practical approach to politics and political challenges. And we see that Machiavelli was also sent in exile. He was accused of conspiracy, and when he was in exile, he wrote The Prince. So The Prince, in his book, The Prince, basically, the prince is a character which he sees as, how a ruler should be. And it is normally not considered as a philosophy for the classroom, but it is seen as a manual for surviving and regaining power in the real world. Then moving forward, it is important to understand that how can we, summarize his political philosophy. There, like when we talk about Plato and Aristotle's political philosophy, we say that they talk about virtue, they talk about city-state, a certain kind of political system, classification of government, and all such wonderful ideas. But when we look at Machiavelli's political surroundings and the lessons that he learned while growing up, the situations that he had seen, he had very different influences. And on the basis of these, we see that Machiavelli's brutally honest philosophy came from bitter personal experiences, which was, watching leaders fail and fall and seeing Italy invaded by Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and also, being tortured and cast out by the same Medici family he tried to outmaneuver. You know, he worked for the Medici family, who was a very famous family of the Florence, and he was appointed as a diplomat by them. But it was very heartbreaking for him to be in exile, and during his years in exile, he wrote The Prince. And he realized that good intentions don't guarantee survival, and in a world full of betrayal and ambition, only power, cunningness, and strength could protect the state. That is why The Prince's book isn't about ruling well, it's about ruling successfully. It is not about the people who are being ruled, it is about the rulers. It is about how a ruler should, govern the state or administration. So when critics, or when normal people, when philosophers, when scholars read his philosophy, they term it as ruthless. They call him very strategic. They call him authoritarian as well, and that you will know why. They also call him very pragmatic, and I think that is quite obvious since the video has begun. I've been talking about how he had a divergence from the classical thought and from the ideal thought. He's also considered cynical. Cynical means someone who goes crazy, someone who goes to extreme lengths in getting or achieving their goals. And he's also considered manipulative and of course immoral. So it is one very important thing in being immoral and immoral. Many people believe that Machiavelli was an immoral person. He was not an immoral person. He did believe in morals, but he said that morals are something that are not used or that are not needed in politics. So this was basically just a summary of what Machiavelli's political philosophy is. Now we'll be discussing the major points of his political philosophy in detail. Okay, so if we discuss Machiavelli's political philosophy, the most simple and most relevant point that comes in our minds is that he is known as the father of political realism. You know, Machiavelli rejected idealism. He said that forget how politics should be, look at how it really is. When we compare him with classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, we get to know that Plato was someone who used reason. Machiavelli, on the other hand, used observation. At the same time, Aristotle promoted virtue, but Machiavelli promoted strategy. So, on this basis, we can say that classical thinkers like Plato and Aristotle focused on how politics should be on the basis of, choosing attributes like justice, virtue, or ideal states. Plato imagined a state ruled by philosopher kings based on morality and truth, whereas Aristotle emphasized ethics and natural hierarchy in a balanced constitutional government. But when we look at Machiavelli's political philosophy, he did not endorse any of these things. In fact, he was completely against all these morality, factions, and all such things. And how we get to know about this is that in the second point, which I've mentioned here, is that he did not believe in any moral foundation. So, when I say this, I mean that Machiavelli believed a ruler needed to be effective, even if that meant using lies, fear, or violence. He divorced politics from ethics, which was radical and even scandalous in his time. So, for classical philosophers, we see that a ruler was supposed to be very good. So, a ruler was supposed to be virtuous. As we talked about philosopher king, we talked about how the idea of citizenship was deep rooted in the idea of being virtuous for Aristotle. So, of course, moral foundation was very important for them, for the classical philosopher. But Machiavelli completely rejected these things. He said that, strategy is something that is needed for running administration, for politics. And then the third point is that Machiavelli believed that religion is a tool and not a truth. So Machiavelli saw religion as a means of control. He believed that it was useful for unifying the states and shaping public behavior, but it was not a divine guide. He believed that religion is something that is just used as a manipulative tool to gain the objectives of the state. On the other hand, classical philosophers often integrated religion or metaphysics into politics. Now, when we talk about classical philosophers, I mean Plato and Aristotle, of course, it did not talk about specifically about Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, but they did believe in an idea of, another world or a perfect form. For example, when you talk about Plato, he talks about his theory of forms and ideas. So what is that? He talks about perfection. So they believe that there is another world, there is another realm, which is better. Or they talk about a ruler being a true philosopher king, being a reflection of morality and virtue, which means that somehow they were associated with the idea of codification of morality and virtues. On the other hand, Aristotle also somehow believed that, a person must have a guiding compass for them to lead a better life. But Machiavelli believed that, religion is just, it is kind of a scam. It is a myth that is used by politicians, by administrators to gain their interest. And then my fourth point, not my fourth point, but the fourth point of Machiavelli's political philosophy is that he believes politics is not equal to morality. Machiavelli separated politics from ethics. A ruler, he believed, must be prepared to act immorally if necessary. So his central idea is the ends justify the means. This is the crux of Machiavelli's political philosophy, which means that the objectives should be defined, and to gain those objectives, anything is justified. As we say, everything is fair between love and war. Sorry, everything is fair in love and war, which means that it does not matter how many lives you are taking away, how many babies you are killing, how many people are dying. It does not matter. You want to gain that, you'll do anything to do that. We can give an example of how Russia and Ukraine conflict is, advancing. We can give an example of this, and most relevant is, of course, the Israel and Palestine conflict in this reference. And then Machiavelli, for the very first time, a philosopher who talked about human nature was Machiavelli. And Machiavelli believed that he saw humans as very shallow beings. He believed that humans are selfish, greedy, and unreliable. And that is why he said that, for a ruler to rule, it is very important that he must know the nature of the people. And he said that the people by nature are very negative, they are greedy, they are brutish, they are savage. So for this purpose, it is very important for the leader to be very strong. A leader should be someone who should not depend on people's loyalty, because people's loyalty shift like, day and night. People will support such a person who will speak for them, who will be in their favor. So a leader cannot rely on such people, because a leader needs to look into permanent ruling opportunities. A leader should be someone who should bring stability in the state. And how can you bring stability? You can bring stability only if you are in a position for a longer period of time, And I think I've discussed this earlier in the video as well, that Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. So when we talk about the ruler, Machiavelli talks about a ruler being this and being that. The character of his ruler is actually named as Prince. So he's basically referring to a prince as a leader, how a prince should behave. And then he also believes that a prince is someone, which means a leader is someone who should be, it's better for him to be feared than to be loved. Because he believes that it is impossible for a leader to do both things. If you fear a leader, you cannot love him. And he believed that it's better that a leader infuses fear for him, not hatred, sorry. A leader infuses fear for him in the society, because when people are fearful of a leader, they believe that they're obliged to follow him. And he believes that fear is a stronger and more consistent motivator than affection, but a ruler must avoid being hated. So basically, a ruler must inculcate a sense of fear in the people, but he must not inculcate a sense of hatred. You get my point? As we see with our parents, that we might fear our parents, but we don't hate them, right? We fear that if we might come late at night, our parents would ask us. But if they, if they kind of scold us, we won't hate them for that particular thing. So that is how he believed a ruler should be. And he also believes that deception is important. He believed that a prince should be someone who is cunning like a fox and strong like a lion. And he believed that deception and brute force must go hand in hand. And then he also believed in another aspect, which was fortune and virtue. So fortune, he believed, is luck and chaos, and virtue is the strength, strategy, and willpower to control events. So basically, his idea of virtue and fortune is very different. When you talk about virtue with respect to classical philosophers, for them, virtue is more about morality. For him, he believes that virtue is being cunning, being smart, being a good strategist, being mentally strong, and having the willpower to control events. And fortune, he says, is luck. So he believes that in the career of a prince, of a ruler, of course he needs to be a good strategist. He must, inculcate fear, but at the same time, he must also be loved. But at the same time, he believes that there's also the aspect of fortune that plays a very important role in the career of a prince. Because if you look at his own life, we see that it was a lot about fortune and goodwill. And another point is that war was very important in his political philosophy. He believed that a prince must have no other object or thought, nor take anything else for his art but war. He saw war and military strength as the backbone of a strong state. A ruler must be ready for war in mind and in preparation, even during peace. So he believed that war is something that should be the goal of the state. He believed in expansionism. He believed that, expanding the states is very important, because in this way, the rulers also remain engaged and the people also remain engaged. And that is a way to you know, gain appreciation, but at the same time also sustain fear against you. So this is a tactic that most of the, we say that in third world countries where there is a hybrid system of government, in such countries, this idea of war is promoted. Why? Because they want to sustain their power. So he also talked about mercenaries. Now, mercenaries is defined as, a group of army that is paid to protect your borders. So back in the days, mercenaries were very common, and Machiavelli believed that mercenaries should not be trusted. He believed that a country should have his own army. So he was very, vocal about such points. He believed that loyalty is something that comes from within, and you cannot trust army of other countries, because he completely rejected the idea of, you can say dishonesty. He believed that if the prince is loyal towards the state, so should be the people. And that is why he said that a wise prince builds a national army loyal to the state, not profit. And you know what used to happen, that most of the time the mercenaries would, from other states, you just pay them and then they just fight for you. They protect your territories. But for him, the idea of sovereignty was very important. So that is why he believed that sovereignty should be something that should be protected from within. That should spring from the idea of loyalty for the love of the state. As I said, that the state, the ends define the means. So he believed that, investment on military should be done, because of course he also promoted the idea of war. So these two concepts are related. And he also talked about taxation and resources. He understood that excessive taxation leads to revolt. But he promoted the idea that a prince should not overburden the people, but he must maintain enough resources to fund armies and projects. At the same time, he was against secularism in politics. Machiavelli separated religion from politics. He didn't reject religion entirely. As I said, that he was amoral, but he was not immoral. In fact, he valued its use in controlling the masses. Machiavelli's political philosophy is basically a handbook of how we should be running a state. So he tells you that, religion is used for this purpose. Religion is not as we perceive it to be. But at the same time, he's promoting that, yeah, but when you are ruling, you must use it to control the minds of the people. So, you can say that he was a political psychologist. He was someone who understood the sentiments of the people. He believed that politics is secular, strategic, and rooted in power, and it is not divine will. He rejected the idea of, that a philosopher king is meant to rule, because if a philosopher king is not able to strategize, if he's not able to protect the borders, if he's relying on mercenaries, if his taxation policies are not strong, if he's not able to inculcate fear in the people, at the same time create an appreciation for himself, then that philosopher king is not a good ruler. So he says that a prince is someone who inculcates all these values, who understands the public sentiment. So, these are the main ideas of main points of Machiavelli's political philosophy. And as I always say, there's always some sort of criticism on political philosophies, and that is what shows that the political philosophy has relevance amongst scholars and academics. So many people agree with Machiavelli's political philosophy, but at the same time, many people also have their disagreements and criticism on his political philosophy. So I'll be discussing a few points. So the first is immorality and cynicism. So critics say that the prince promotes ruthlessness, deception, and cruelty. His advice to manipulate, kill rivals, and use fear violates moral and ethical standards, especially from religious or virtue-based perspectives. I mean, this is such a simple thing that I don't think I need to explain it, specifically with reference to the modern day global and strategic advancements. I think these Machiavelli suits well in today's political realm. So quite easy to understand, I'm sure. So the second point is ends justify the means. So this is very dangerous doctrine. For example, you are not taking into account what is at stake. For example, if I say that Israel wants to have complete control over the Gaza Strip, that's an end. End means goal. That's its goal. Now it says that my goals will justify my mean. I do not care how much weapon I'm going to use. I don't care how many people are going to die. I don't care whatever laws I'm violating. If that is my goal and I want to achieve that goal, whatever I do in between is justified. which is a very wrong and very dangerous doctrine, right? So this kind of promotes the idea that any action is acceptable if the outcome is good and is seen as deeply dangerous. This is a very deeply dangerous doctrine. Many argue that this thinking has justified dictatorships, fascism, and authoritarian regimes. Whenever you look at, you can look at the rule of Hitler. What was his ideology? His ideology was, of course, Nazism, but his idea was to gain power, was to execute war, and to do that he kind of manipulated, he spread, he made efforts to spread propaganda so much that people had become extremists to an extent that they started hating Jews. We know the Holocaust happened, and it was very bad. So how does this happen? Because you are not taking into account the means that are going to be used, or the means that are going to be at stake in the process of achieving your goal. You get my point? And then of course another point of criticism is that he does not talk about law or institutions. He does talk about how diplomacy should be done. He does talk about how a political leader should be, but he does not basically focus on law institutions or the rule of law. He kinds of downplays all these important institutions. And in today's modern world, we live in a world of liberalism where institutions are very important. He kind of, overemphasized role of individual leader, in which kind of gives an idea that he was in the favor of a very strong individualistic leadership, which is not very which does not sit well in contemporary political scenario. And then he had a very negative view of human nature. His belief that people are selfish, cowardly, and easily manipulated is considered overly pessimistic and may undermine democratic ideals based on trust and participation. Because if this was true, see, we need to understand that the world is never in black and white. It needs to be in gray. It is in gray, right? In a state, not all people are extremists, right? When anybody labels Pakistanis as terrorists, all Pakistanis are terrorists, we kind of resist, we protest against it, because that's not true. Yes, it could be possible that there's certain faction in our country which has been a victim of extremism and eventually radicalism and terrorism, but that does not mean that everyone in the country promotes an extremist ideology or extremist point of view. So his idea of generalizing human nature as negative is not very true, and it's very pessimistic, and you cannot be so stringent in your political philosophies that you choose one side in defining human nature. And of course he had some crazy obsession with power. People like Rousseau and Montesquieu, they are such philosophers who believed in balance of power. They believed in in promotion of public opinion. So when you talk about public opinion prevailing and balance of power, so it is something where the citizens are given a lot of leverage. But when you read Machiavelli's political philosophy, you get to know that he overemphasizes on the what can you say, on the power that is given to the ruler, on the power that is given to the prince. And this power is something that is glorified for its own sake. This is a power that the prince enjoys for his own gains. It might be possible that a prince might take a decision that might not be in the favor or in the benefit of, or for the benefit of the citizens, but since he wants to sustain his power, as Hitler did, he could do anything. And this promotes, and this kind of does not promote justice, liberty, or collective welfare, but this only promotes individualism. And then, of course, his philosophy is inapplicable in modern democratic societies. See, Machiavelli's ideas, his kind of, authoritarianism, fear, and the kind of things he talks about could only work in monarchies or crisis states. Crisis states means like a situation where the state is failing, and there needs to be a leadership which kinds of, uses all the tactics to unite the people and to sustain its leadership. But his theory, his political idea cannot be worked in modern democracies where legitimacy comes from elections and law, not manipulation of fear. At least in theory we can say this. Of course the trends are changing, but still there's no denying the fact that we live in a world of liberalism where institutions, laws are very important. And then he kind of encourages tyranny. By justifying manipulation and cruelty, Machiavelli has been accused of laying the intellectual groundwork for tyrants and dictators from who have the ones who we have witnessed in the 20th century, naming, again, I'm going to name Adolf Hitler, and then Benito Mussolini. And there have been many people, for that fact, maybe Saddam Hussein as well, and many dictators. Of course, people might have different point of views, but and I'm not denying the fact that such leaders do not propel economic development or any other kind of development. They might propel development, but if you justify your examples, your case studies with proper examples, then you can write them. But of course, you need to justify them. And then he kind of, cherry picked historical examples. It was what we see in his political philosophy is that there's selective use of history. For example, when you read his philosophy in true sense, in its proper text, original text, you see that he gives examples of how in old empires people used to follow such ideas, his political ideas that were prevalent back in the days as well. And he believed that such states were successful, such leaders were successful. But he kind of failed to present a very holistic image, because he might say that, yeah, by following all the ideas promoted by him, a leader might sustain his leadership, or one might, sustain short-term success or development. But you kind of ignore ethical aspect, or the ideals of democracy, like egalitarianism, or peace, and global coexistence and all such things. So he kind of only focuses on selective aspects and presents his theory as being the perfect one. Of course, every philosopher does that, but in Machiavelli's case, he's too extreme in promoting ideas that are much that are closer to the spectrum of authoritarianism and, you can say, totalitarianism. But to conclude, we can say that whether one sees Machiavelli as a genius or a dangerous mind, is no denying the impact that he has on the Western political thought. He tore away illusions and forced people to ask the hardest questions in politics, because if you look from a neutral point of view, the points that he talks about are something that are very relevant in today's world. So he basically